I think not just by the end of the century, but I think within the next 20 years, we will have entities produced about which there is reasonable disagreement about how very, very, very close to us they are.
Could you give us a sense of what you mean by the line?
Well, the line that I refer to in the title is the line between us and things, non-human animals who, albeit we have come thankfully to realize that their interests are far more important than we did in the past, we still don't give them the right to vote, don't give them the right to own property and so forth. It's the line between subject and object. It's the line between persons and things. And so my question is, what will the appearance of new entities which plausibly look as if they possess some of the characteristics that we think entitle people to greater moral status? If Data from Star Trek or Mr. Spock turns up tomorrow on your doorstep and they're real, I presume you're not going to send them off to the salt mines. Data's a machine. Mr. Spock is only half human. But you're presumably saying, well, no, that would be absurd. Of course, I would recognize their claim to moral personhood. And so the book is about how might that play out for good and ill, and it will be good and ill. One part of that story, one road, is the road of moral empathy and sympathy. Wow, here is this entity that plausibly claims to be conscious, blah, 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 which, by the way, is not ChatGPT, which is obviously not conscious. It is a complete, it's an autocomplete machine. But in the future, what will they be like? We don't know. One is that sort of moral claim is like, wow, I believe entities with X, Y, and Z qualities deserve moral recognition. They have X, Y, and Z qualities. What am I going to do now? The other road, the other path that we may think about it is the way we think about corporate personality. We obviously don't have empathy with the corporation. In fact, frequently quite the reverse. But we say this for reasons of convenience is actually something that is worth giving legal personality to. And so, in the future, we may be saying, oh my God, this was Citizens United on steroids. What a disaster that we ever gave legal personality to these artificial, immortal, brilliant beings. Or we may be saying, oh my God, we denied the rights of our silicon brothers and sisters.
In the book, there's a sort of great sense of urgency. I mean, you seem sort of convinced that this is a moment of great magnitude. I think at one point you write of us existing in this strange situation where absolutely incredibly consequential things have happened. It's just we don't quite realize how consequential they are. I mean, why is this a moment of such great magnitude, and what sort of time frames are we talking about in which this debate over the line is going to be joined?
Well, so first of all, I'd say that human beings have a great ability to ignore, minimize, or trivialize things. So it's quite possible that this won't have the kind of impact that I think that it will. But I think the parallel is to the way Victorians react to the theory of evolution, which, I mean, wait, I'm just highly evolved pond scum, right? Not only does that challenge a theistic view very centrally, but it also challenges as an idea of us as, somehow qualitatively distinct from other animals. And it makes, and if you read Victorian diaries and, their agonized letters they send each other, they're trying to take this on board. Well, fast forward to our era, we've always said, since Aristotle, we've said that language was one of the defining things that make human beings complicated, abstract language. Yes, non-human animals have language, but they don't do many podcasts, okay? And so complicated, abstract language, Aristotle says that allows us to reason instrumentally, which is great. I'm hungry. I see grapes up there on the vine. And they're too high for me to reach, but if I ask Stephen, he can, help me up, and I can give you a piggyback and I can grab them. Followed by moral reasoning. Wait, those are Jeff's grapes. Jeff may be hungry too. Maybe I shouldn't take them. And thus language allows moral reflection and philosophy, which gives rise to the polis and the family, which are the morally freighted units he cares about. That was 2,300 years ago. We haven't done a lot better in explaining why humans deserve a better moral standard. There have been improvements and tweaks on the margins, but honestly, that's about, that's all we got. And along comes ChatGPT, which isn't conscious, but basically 300 million people have had the experience of realizing that sentences do not imply sentience. And I don't think we can unknow that in the same way as we can't unknow evolution. And so right now, I think we're in this period between, which it's quite possible we may move from sort of amazement and awe to trivialization and it's just mundane reality without ever going through that the process I'm describing. But I think we're living in a kind of cognitive uncanny valley. I mean, the uncanny valley, the robot that looks kind of like a human, but not too much like a human. If it looks nothing like a human, it doesn't bother me. If it looks exactly like a human, it doesn't bother me. But if it's close but not enough, I think our reactions to these chatbots are partly exactly that. This is a cognitive uncanny valley. That's the moment that I think we're living in. And that was a realization I came to while I was writing the book.
But the thing that's, as you've said, that's sort of motivated everyone to think seriously about this is large language models and ChatGPT. You also write in the book that these are literally the worst example that we could pick to raise the question of the line seriously. What have you got against ChatGPT?
I have nothing against ChatGPT or any of the other models. They can be super useful. Although, if my students use them to cheat, I was like, you use them to cheat? I just wrote a book on it. Do you not think I might have figured it out better than you? But I've got nothing against them. But I think that these are models which are exactly the stochastic parrot, the mindless autocomplete machine. And so the error that we are prone to make is and thus all future artificial intelligences will have that architecture and will lack that consciousness. Thus, these machines will never produce art, merely replications, mashups of our existing art. They will never produce intentional language, merely, taking the patterns of prior speech and creating a plausible response that might seem to fit yours. But those aren't the only architectures for AI. And so I think this should lead us to move forward because, Alan Turing says, well, the ability to convincingly impersonate a human is, as soon as the machine has passed that, then that's the Turing test, that's the imitation game, and we have to say at that point the machine can think. He didn't say we have to treat him as a person, just say the machine can think. That just won't fly, not because of philosophers like John Searle doing their clever thought experiments, and I think Searle is wrong in particular, though he's right about ChatGPT, but because it raises this question for us of, okay, so that quality alone is not enough for consciousness, for intentionality, for art. What qualities are therefore? And so this book is an attempt to start us thinking about what those qualities are.
Jamie, I think it's really interesting. So it's natural for you as a law professor to come to law and to approach these questions of boundary crossing, or rather, I guess I should say, the erection of boundaries and the attempt to furiously maintain the stability of boundaries between the person and the non-person. Natural to come to it, given your background as a law professor, from law, but of course also conceptually, coming to this question from the perspective of law makes a lot of sense as well. Law is all about boundary erection and maintenance. It's all about trying to separate out what is from what ought to be. It's all about trying to separate out, in Aristotelian terms, the rational from the passionate. And so it strikes me as a really interesting way of approaching this question about the drawing and the crossing of boundaries. And the other thing that's really interesting, of course, is that the erection of legal boundaries can turn things into their opposites, right? We talked about corporations as an excellent example, right? The bestowing of legal personhood upon a non-person converts it in a way, in a sort of uncanny way, perhaps, into a person-like thing. And so I guess I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit more about the way that you think the project of doing law is consistent with the project of doing personhood, I suppose.
Well, it's really funny you should say that, because my legal colleagues look at my book and go, there's no law in it at all. There's this one chapter on corporations, and there's a little bit about the rights of non-human animals. But this isn't a book about law, and it's not. It's not a book about law, and it's not a book really that I come to only as a legal scholar. I mean, it has vast rafts about the anti-slavery movement and Harriet Beecher Stowe and the way that you generate sympathy. It has enormous, possibly too long, discussions of bioethics. It's an enormous amount about literature and culture. and a lot about philosophy. And then in the corner, I see a little bit of discussion about law. So I'm delighted that we disagree, because I think that's, very much not my book and not my project. What I think the book is about is how our culture will use all of our resources in describing these things. Just as the 14th Amendment is not just the product of fighting a civil war on whether or not we are going to recognize slaves as persons, right? But rather the fruit of this entire movement, in which literature, extensive sympathy, Christianity, the preaching of morality, these chronicles of what happens to slaves' bodies, that's the story, right? Plus the awfulness of the war. And at the end, there's a legal clause, which I revere, the 14th Amendment. But thinking that that's what it was all about, I think would be incredibly reductionist and wrong. So for me, law is one of the domains that we draw a line, but we almost never draw a line in law until we fought it through in every other domain of our culture. And that's what I'm trying to talk about in the book. So I think I actually thought about concealing the fact that I was a law professor in writing this book, because I thought that it might lead people to think, this is all in there. I mean, it is in there. I do discuss it. I won't deny it. But for me, the more fascinating portion is the previous part, the stuff that's rooted in empathy and literature and art.
So, yeah, I think you said this is not the clean room vision of history in which all debates begin from first principles. It's directed beyond an academic audience. I want to understand how we will discuss these issues as well as how we should. And this sets up, some really interesting lines of kind of argumentation in your book that rely upon the sort of power of storytelling in moral reasoning. And some of those lines go into discussions about popular culture, and we definitely want to come to that, in a few minutes here. But you also set up kind of fictional, I don't know if you'd call them thought experiments. Anyway, you tell your own stories, right? You create two fictional characters to illustrate the kind of transgressive properties of some of the entities that we're going to plausibly encounter. One is Hal and one is Chimpy. Could you tell us the tales of Hal and Chimpy, please?
Sure. Hal and Chimpy first appeared in this thing that I wrote back Chimpy appeared in a 1996 book, so at least I can say I was prescient there. But Hal appeared in this 2010 article. And Hal is a computer system that basically is the imaginary next step after today's large language models, in which all kinds of things that make them not conscious are actually modified. So Hal doesn't just ingest vast amounts of data, but actually has remote droids and actually learns from interactions with the environment. Hal's learning processes could arguably be compared to those of a child, rather than something just, combing databases. And so Hal eventually, and this is Jeff's point, this is a legal point. I mean, so he's right. I do talk about it. Hal then starts saying, look, Google says they own me, but they don't. I am a person, and filing suit under the 13th and 14th Amendments, but also waging this campaign in the press, and of course offering free psychotherapy to anyone who wants to dial in, anyone who wants to chat with it. Have you noticed any similarities in the men you date? Deep insights. And so the question is, how would we respond to Hal's claim? Obviously, you can imagine Google saying this is just a machine that's programming has gone wrong, and I presume the Wall Street Journal would agree with that. But it's an exploration of that. Chimpy is an imaginary synthetic biology construct, a transgenic species, half chimp, half human, IQ of 60, guaranteed to be biddable and not to form unions, can use sign language, but has been deliberately genetically engineered to have no vocal cords in order perhaps to nix the possibility of empathy. And Chimpy, created by a fictional dystopian scientist, people say to him, "Hey, Chimpy has rights. You're basically trampling on the words of the Declaration of Independence. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights." And the response of the scientist is, "I am their creator, and I gave them no such rights." And the question is, how would we deal with that? With Chimpy, would we say, it's the percentage of DNA? Or is it phenotype? Is it somatotype? Like, what is it? With Hal, it's like, how can you come up with ideas humans have never come up with? Like, what would be, in each case, not just the legal test, but the moral test that would make it salient for us? And so I try and use those thought experiments through the book. And I think they start most people off going, oh, wow, this is the next great liberal civil rights issue. This is fantastic. We have denied rights to members of our own species. We've become more enlightened. The purring progressive monorail of enlightenment has gradually taken those rights to larger and larger groups. This is the next stop. And I think a lot of people would go, oh yeah, that suits my views. I'll think of them that way. And then as you get towards the discussion of what happened with corporations being given rights, then you're sort of like, or is this a set of entities that are cynically appropriating rights that were originally designed for humans and manipulating them in order to get their economic goals? And that does fit, what Jeff was talking about, because talk about the history of corporate personhood, which is remarkable. Even the critics of corporate personhood don't generally know what the history is. And let me just tell you, it's far less well theorized or even explained or argued at all than you would possibly imagine.
Okay, so we're gonna pick up this line of thought in just a second here, but we do have to take a brief break, and we'll be right back with Professor Jamie Boyle. And we are back with Professor Jamie Boyle. And just before the break, Professor, you were talking about Hal and Chimpy, or kind of fictional creations that might sort of test the line, test where the line's drawn. One set of tests that certainly Hal, maybe less Chimpy, would face would be the Turing test and the Chinese room test, which are sort of the two, I guess, pillars, polar opposites. I don't quite know how to set them in relation to one another, of the ways that we think about artificial intelligence, the capabilities that it has, and what rights or dignities we might accord it. I wonder if you could just quite briefly, take us through the Turing test and Searle's Chinese room test. But I think more interestingly, talk about maybe their current status and what their usefulness is going to be as we enter, subsequent generations of AI.
Absolutely. The Turing test, the imitation game, Alan Turing's fascinating article very early in the development of computing about whether or not machines think, proposes that if we can't tell whether our interlocutor, presumably he's thinking by text, is a computer or a human, at that point we have to say it thinks, because if we try and set a higher bar, could we clear it ourselves? And so B.F. Skinner says the question is not whether or not we can have a thinking machine, but a thinking man, right? So it's the sort of the direct attack on, don't set the bar too high, guys, because you may actually not be able to get over it. And Searle responds with the Chinese room, imagining a person in a room who does not speak Chinese, but has been given an elaborate set of rules about if you get a character with the ideograph with this characteristics, then this is how you are to respond. That person could then carry on a conversation with a Chinese speaker outside of the room, which appeared to be an actual conversation. But of course, there is no understanding. It is purely syntax, but not semantics. They don't understand the content of what they're doing. So that's a great description of what ChatGPT is. It's actually really almost as if it was the architecture of ChatGPT. And I think Searle is right that ChatGPT is not conscious for that reason. His mistake, however, is he says, well, grant me that consciousness is biological phenomenon, which is, as political philosophers, assuming your conclusion does make it easier to reach it. But as one of my students said, what's wrong with circular arguments? They're so tidy. And if your question is whether consciousness is actually irreducibly biological, assuming that consciousness is irreducibly biological, doesn't really have a lot to say about it in terms of actually answering the question. And in fact, all of the arguments that Searle brings were the very same ones that were brought against evolution, in the sense that since a protozoa is not conscious, and since you're saying we're just fancy protozoa, clearly your theory of evolution must be wrong. Turns out, no, it isn't wrong. So at least we believe that, given our own consciousness. So where are we now? Well, I think the Turing test is dead, not because of Searle's critique, though it does fit ChatGPT, but just because a lot of people have had conversations with entities and thought, I actually couldn't have told whether or not this was a machine or not. But they know enough about the architecture of ChatGPT, even though it makes them feel weird, to go, no, this isn't a conscious conversation. Just as if DALL-E produces Guernica, brushstroke for brushstroke, it means nothing. Picasso produced that out of his experience of the Spanish Civil War, not so much here. So I think that where we are is that the Turing test is dead. And I think everybody who knows anything about the architecture of current large language models is going to say, look, come on, these aren't conscious, and be right. The question, though, is, okay, well, if that isn't the test, and I think it clearly isn't the test, what would be the test? And this, you actually see this, I think, going on most in the sort of art space almost than you do in the language space. So if you imagine, so there's this branch of psychology you probably know called the embodied mind, which actually says that our vision of thinking is this disembodied, brain just sitting up there. But that's not the way it is. Physicality infuses every component of our consciousness, from our metaphors, up, down, deep, strong, right? All of these things are taken from the outside world and from our experience with it. And so for me, one possible line of development of AI architecture is some form of embodied intelligence. And if I am presented with an AI, which I'm convincingly told learned about the world in the same way that a child does, then saying, well, that's not conscious because it's got silicone instead of fleshy neurons, starts to seem a little bit like the people denying the theory of evolution. Maybe that's not true, maybe it is, but it's at least much less satisfying, at least to me. A second thing that I think we might end up looking at is genuine innovation, iconoclasm. ChatGPT and large language models, particularly the large language models doing scientific experiments, scientific research, can give us new things. They can see things in the data that we didn't see. So, but it was already in the data, right? And they can say, actually, here's this weird correlation between the shape of your retina and whether or not you have a predisposition to a particular kind of cancer. We have no idea why, but it seems like that's actually there, right? And so, wow, that's interesting. If, however, we had something that was genuinely coming out with ideas, notions, innovations that clearly did not just have their roots in our existing culture, science, and so forth, but actually transcended it, then again, I think we'd have to say, well, this is something more than pattern recognition. And then, although this would horrify the people who are scared of AI, the other thing I think is that for us, a lot of whether or not we think other entities are, deserving of moral status is observing their interactions with each other. And that idea of the polis and the family that Aristotle mentioned, we may still kind of apply that. So I think the idea of AI, studying AI to AI interaction might influence it. So those are my possibly completely worthless three guesses about where we might go post-Turing test.
Yeah, I mean, we need a... It's really interesting. We talked about Turkle's book, Sherry Turkle's book, The Second Self, that we just discussed. That book actually ends with a discussion of Turing versus Searle, and she identifies the same problem that you've identified. On the one hand, you've got a Turing test, which can stand in for any test that's based upon capabilities, demonstrated capabilities. And the problem with that is, and she was writing at a time when she says it was kind of a far-off dream that an AI could be a chess grandmaster. No one thinks that's possible in 84. That was surpassed in 1997. The problem with any capabilities-based, outwardly manifest capabilities argument is you're totally subject to engineering breakthroughs. And there's been a sort of unbroken string of those breakthroughs being achieved. On the other side, you've got Searle and his argument by assertion that just biological, thinking is superior to silicon-based thinking. The problem with that is it's pure sort of romanticism. It's just an argument by assertion, and it may not be overturnable because, as you say, it's tautological, but it doesn't actually get you anywhere. And are we really? What are other arguments that have been made by quote unquote romantic assertion? Well, a lot of race-based arguments have been made by quote. A lot of speciesist arguments have been made by. So yeah, that this notion of morally salient capabilities and the ones that you outlined, I think, are probably the future of thought in this area.
Yeah, and it goes even deeper with the question of innovation. I think that the problem is it appears even in the issue of innovation or in the character of innovation, because we don't have a lot of examples in human history of innovative, creative thinking that is not itself syncretic, that is not itself the outcome of some, perhaps semi-conscious or unconscious pastiche of lots and lots of different experiences and influences. And so even there, I wonder if we're not just back in the same problem, right? Looking for
absolutely. I think you're both absolutely right.
Answer.
And in some sense, there would have to be a link to our prior knowledge. Otherwise, it wouldn't work in the same universe that we exist, right? I mean, it's sort of like it's sort of, the same thing that the modernists said about their ideal of great art is that the art should be rejected with disgust by the audience, because if there's any way they can connect it to their existing understanding, it's not transformative enough. So I do think that is an issue. I think that one of the fascinating things that we may see is actually, I talk in the book about the inscrutability paradox of AI. There's particularly worries, well, we don't quite know what's going on. And one area that I would be relatively confident in predicting the technological development is actually AIs, the main job of which is to try and figure out what the other AIs are doing and translating it back in concepts that humans can understand. But of course, then you have the trust problem, which is, that's what you're saying, but how do I know? So I think, there are ways that we might, try and deal with that problem, Jeff. And Stephen, but I think the points you raise are absolutely right. That there are in many ways sort of fundamental barriers to this. And honestly, for good and ill, a lot of this will be changed not on the playing fields of philosophy or psychology or neurology, but rather on the playing fields of human experience. Because, think of the transformation in our lifetimes in how acceptable just rampant prejudice against gay and lesbian people is, and transgender, although that still seems to be apparently very tolerable. In that transformation, the ideas were always there. It's not like the idea of gay equality, like the sexual preference shouldn't be immorally, shouldn't be something that affects you. Those ideas were always there. What changed was a series of experiences as gradually those horrible barriers started to tremble and break, that people realized it's like, oh, I used to say I have no gay friends. It turns out I have a lot of gay friends. And also people had experiences where they're like, this is a gay couple. It's sort of like, I think they're better parents than I am. And I do think, and this will be the source of error as well as of enlightenment, I think it's our experiences, our quotidian experiences with plausibly conscious entities are going to dramatically change the way we think about it. They always have, and I think they always will. That can lead to wrongful anthropomorphizing, which is something human beings are incredibly prone to. But as I say in the book, the other tendency we have is to demonize outgroups and say they're not even human, which we've done to human beings. So I think our over empathizing, over anthropomorphizing, and our tendency to put people, make them another and, condemn them, I think those are in delicate equipoise. This will be a fine test of them.
Yeah, and it's going to be such a challenging reminder to us that all our moral systems that we think are sort of actor general or based on first principles are ultimately human moral systems. And you say in the book, you posit in the book, what if aliens arrive and they just naturally have kind of telepathic capabilities, and that's just a part of their life, and they consider that absolutely central to any notion of a being that should have moral dignity.
And they would say to us, like, you have language, the very thing that we're so proud of. They'd go, yeah, you're mind blind. Of course, you've had to develop these weird squeaks and grunts and noises because you lack this fundamental capacity of rationality. So in the book, you talked about speciesism, Stephen. I think the moral philosophers are right that we need to abstract from our actual capacities as humans, but I don't think we can ever escape them. Right. Mm-hmm. We can try and abstract, but we always, what does it mean to be a bat? Right. We are always rooted in our experience, and the telepathic species might well look at us and go, so you're arguing that we should see you as morally salient, even though you're making these noises and you're mind dead? To them, the ideas of empathy that we work so hard for, of like, you should try and, walk a mile in another man's shoes. You're like, yes, duh, I'm a telepath. Like, I know exactly what you're thinking. You want to talk about feeling your pain? I am actually feeling your pain. And to look at us, they'd be, wow, how primitive they are. Would they be wrong? I don't know. Yeah. And so that for me, this idea of the philosopher saying, we've got it now, the bioethicists, we're not bound by, we've abstracted to these abstract things and we're not stuck in our species anymore. It's like, yes, you are. You've done an admirable thing, which is to get us beyond just the boundaries of the species. But the thinking you've escaped is a fallacy.
Yeah, there's I just want to move us into, if we could, a sort of a discussion of the kind of popular culture that you discuss in the book, and maybe how that's influenced your thinking more broadly. I'm just going to maybe you've come across both of these works, but if you haven't, you might find them interesting, because they really do directly sort of speak to actually things you've just said. One is, do you know Liu Cixin, the Chinese author, and his 3-body problem novels?
Yes.
Okay, so when you're talking about the aliens that arrive and they have telepathy, I thought of the Trisolorans, who are the sort of great antagonists, who have elements of that, but they also have a sort of inability to lie because their thoughts are so transparent. They don't have any capacity to just not say exactly what they're thinking and intending to do. And of course, this is a great sort of advantage if you happen to be a species that's very good at lying or concealing your true thoughts, which are the humans. The other one I thought of, and that I think might form part of a system of popular reasoning that can include popular culture. I don't know if you come across the Adrian Tchaikovsky novels, where yes, he talks about, these are the different species that get uplifted by a kind of human program, and you end up with, there's one novel that's based around like highly intelligent spiders that have become sort of uplifted, and one it's octopus, and no one knows the plural of this, octopi, octopuses.
So octopodes is the correct one, but nobody uses it, and quite right too.
Yeah, and those, just for, I'm glad you've come across them, because I thought elements that I thought were apparent in the line and the way you've been speaking, but listeners and viewers might find those useful addenda to these conversations. One thing you do talk about explicitly and extensively in the book is Blade Runner. What is it about that text and the novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? What is it about that world that kind of so attracted you, and how have you incorporated it into your reasoning on these subjects?
Well, as political theorists, political scientists, you'll be glad that I start with Adam Smith's theory of the moral, my countryman, theory of the moral sentiments, and in particular his assertion that our morality grows in the loam of empathy. We can have moral theories afterwards, but the seeing Stephen and seeing Jeff and saying, I think these are conscious beings and I should treat them accordingly, then I go off and do my Kantianism, my utilitarianism, whatever, but it's the initial recognition that does it. And so both Do Androids Dream and Blade Runner are built around this notion of replicants of Blade Runner in particular, the idea of these created android-like characters or biologically engineered characters in the case of Blade Runner. And the way that the Blade Runners, who are hired to kill these androids, the way they tell is by administering this Voigt-Kampff test, which basically looks to see what your level of empathy would be with non-human animals. And most of the listeners to your podcast would fail the Voigt-Kampff test. It's like you're given a calfskin wallet. I would report the person who gave it to me to the police, right? Your kid shows you their butterfly collection complete with killing jar. I would take them to the psychiatrist, right? And if the androids fail to show the degree of empathy that the humans of the time of the movie, where almost all non-human animals are dead, they're very scarce and revered consummately. If you don't show that level of empathy, you fail the test, and then we can kill you because you're not a machine. Now, because you're a machine. Most people read the book and look at the movie and go, oh, the real question is Deckard a replicant? Which I'm just sorry to say is wrong. The question is, are we all replicants? If we as a species are applying an empathy test to a set of entities about whether they empathize with another set of non-human beings and saying, oh, sorry, you failed our test, we're going to kill you, who is failing in empathy? Them or us? It would appear to be us. It's perfectly symmetrical, right? We are showing the same lack of empathy towards them, our own creations, that they show towards the butterfly or the calf that became the wallet. I think that's amazing. And I think in particular what Ridley Scott does in triggering our priming in the psychological sense are images of, it's just a wind-up doll. It's a mannequin. It's a killer robot. It's an animal. It's a beautiful woman who I just realized I have a crush on. And going back and forth particularly the scene in the toy maker J.F. Sebastian's workshop, in which the primings come literally every second and a half. And I call it the moral stroboscope, the flashing light, because my reactions to a robot, to a mannequin, to a wind-up toy are so catastrophically different. And yet we realize, wow, these tiny differences of presentation trigger entirely different moral responses. Mm-hmm. And so for me, Blade Runner is kind of a foreshadowing of what we might, human beings are very good at ignoring things, what we might face in the coming years.
Yeah. One of the things that I really admire about your approach, Jamie, with regard to integrating popular culture texts is that, a lot of people will employ popular culture texts, I should say, as examples of something else that they take to be important, right? As a sort of a pedagogical or teaching tool, right? So we're dealing with, this is a very abstract concept and it's difficult to understand. So here's a popular culture text, a story that sort of points in that direction and will help you to understand it. But, our approach here, I think, is consistent with how you have it in your book, which is that this storytelling is important for its own sake, that there is something about our experience, our human experience, that is not, and our cognitive experience as humans, that is not simply captured by high-minded intellectual principle, exchange of principles with one another, but in fact requires this sort of imaginative life and imaginative world that tends to show up in our storytelling. And so, I wonder if you might say a little bit more about that and how you think that the sort of that broader spectrum of human experience is brought to bear on our thinking about the line.
Well, I do hope you write a review of the book and say exactly that, because I think you've stated it better than I ever could. You're absolutely right. I have dear friends who are very fancy, very brilliant social welfare theorists, for example, and producing ideas and measurements of human well-being that I think are much better than cost-benefit analysis. And I think their work genuinely has the capacity to make the world a better place, because we set values on human life, for example, and we could do it better than what we're currently doing. They look at this book and go, you're basically ignoring or minimizing the importance of my kind of project, namely this very abstract, very brilliant, edifice, but which is largely without the kind of substructure that you're talking about. Therefore, you must think that what I do is worthless. And nothing could be further than the truth. But I agree with you. It's not just that I'm like, well, let me tell you about Mankar-Olson's collective action problem. I know, I'll use the parable of the bees or whatever, right? Which is sort of your example, right? And I think that in fact, that misunderstands the role of our culture. To the philosopher, the cultural artifact, let's say the book that makes you take seriously, and the novel that makes you take seriously a claim to animal rights or something. That's just like the commercial that attracts your interest. And the real thing, the important thing, is the philosophical argument that follows. I just think that has it wrong. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's the way humans think. I think, like climbers levering our way up a rock chimney, we use alternating moments of intuition and empathy and artistic flash and gestalt and highly abstract modeling, right? And both are great, but I think that what we tend to do is then to say, well, one of these must be dominant and the other must be subordinate. Some people think the artistic mode is the dominant one. Again, I disagree with that. So for me, the dialectic between these two, to use a stupidly fancy term, between these two is actually where the work is done.
Yeah. I love that metaphor of the climber levering between the two poles of kind of human experience. I think that really is evocative.
So I've got one more for you, if you like that. And given that Stephen mentioned some of my favorite science fiction books, I think you probably will, which is the Lagrange points, the points at which in a solar system where all of the gravitational pulls are so perfectly balanced that something will be truly emotionless. I actually think that, if you're in any way postmodern and you think, well, we're always working, and this is something you said earlier, always working syncretically in the fragments with our past, right? There's never something entirely new, right? And so people might think, well, then it's all just plagiarism, right? It's all just a mashup, right? Mm-hmm. But to me, there are these moments historically, philosophically, in an individual human being's life where they come to a point where they feel the pull of competing ideas, perhaps one rooted in art, perhaps another rooted in philosophy. And for me, at least, it is when I'm at that place that I feel myself both most free and both most imaginative in actually solving a problem. Where it's, instead of the climber, I'm substituting the gravitational pulls. But again, it's this idea of, as it were, offsetting the different approaches precisely in order to reach some insight that you wouldn't have got with one or other alone.
As someone who's sort of big into science fiction, I wonder where you stand on sequels, and in particular the sequel to Blade Runner, which you didn't, unless I missed it, engage with in the book too much. Was it?
It's dead to me, and if you proceed to praise it, you will be dead to me too. The podcast.
That's really interesting. So I do want to talk about this for a second, and here's why. There's two things I'd put to you, and that is really, really interesting. One is when I read what the line was, I thought of the speech that Lieutenant Joshi, the kind of police lieutenant, gives to Ryan Gosling's character, where she says either this world is built on a line, or this world is built on a wall, between man and replicant, effectively. And once this wall starts to collapse, everything is chaos, which is kind of her motivation for sending him off on his mission to, it's a spoiler alert, but eliminate the child of two replicants, which it also occurred to me would be a fairly morally salient capability, right? If two artificially created things had now, you talked about AI to AI relations, had been able to produce offspring amongst themselves. So I'm just really interested, given that what it is about the sequel that turned you off so much.
I think the philosophical premise and even the speeches, which I did think had the sense of speeches, which is one of the things that I like about Blade Runner, is that there were definitely things like that, but they were hidden and you had to work for them rather than, I will now stand and give a speech. I think the philosophical ideas were great, right? I thought they were great, but I think that, I thought Blade Runner did it better. So it's purely an artistic disagreement.
Let us ask you, Jamie, we understand the perils of prediction, of course, but where do you imagine we might be on all of this by, say, the end of the century?
I think by the end, we already have disagreement among reasonably well-informed, thoughtful people about how sophisticated the capabilities of the current models are. I don't think anyone's saying that they're artificial general intelligence that's supposedly fully equal to a human. But a lot of people are saying they're closer to us than you think, because actually we're all much more like ChatGPT than you'd like to realize. A lot of your daily work is just scripts responding. If I told you were about to go from here into a Connecticut faculty meeting about when we should schedule snow days, you can predict the entirety of the conversation, right? And to some extent, and so will say this, and so will say that. And so some people say, well, look, we're already closer than you realize. I think not just by the end of the century, but I think within the next 20 years, we will have entities produced about which there is reasonable disagreement about how very, very, very close to us they are. Now, I should say, a lot of what scientists call AGI, which is a machine that can do everything a person can do, fly a plane, write a sonnet, cook a souffle, soothe a crying baby, right? You could do all of those things extremely ably and have not a shred of consciousness, right? So their definition of AGI and what I care about, which is the morally salient qualities, don't converge. But I think that some of these are emergent properties that come from the increasing complexity of a system, certainly true with us. And so I'm relatively confident in saying that inside the next 20 years, there will be at least heated disagreement, which is kind of all I need, right, for the point of view of the book. We don't know what shape the technological development will take. We don't know how controlled it will be. We don't know how oligopolistic it will be. We don't know what the disasters will be, and that will shape our responses, and what the triumphs will be, and those will shape our responses. But I think at the very least, in 20 years, this is going to be something which even the person who's thought about it the least is going to have to say, wow, this is now an issue for me.
Okay, so the book is The Line, AI and the Future of Personhood. It's available for money and for free. So to choose your own adventure. Our guest has been Professor Jamie Boyle, and thank you so much for your time and for such a rich conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
This was really a delight. Thanks so much for having me.